In this 10-minute sermon, I'd like to walk through the book of Habakkuk. Now, at its core, just like the book of Job, Habakkuk is a study in theodicy, which in simple terms is the problem of evil and suffering in the world. Habakkuk is a prophet. For those of you who are not familiar, Habakkuk is a prophet for the nation of Judah, possibly during the reign of King Jehoiakim, before the Babylonian captivity. In chapter 1, Habakkuk is crying out to God and basically asking where he is in the midst of all the things Habakkuk is seeing take place. He decries the injustice he sees, he points out the violence he has witnessed, and he complains about strife and conflicts that are all around him. He's painting a very familiar picture for the nation of Judah, and if we are honest, it does not seem to look any different for us who are living here and now. Now, because of chapter 1, Habakkuk has every reason to leave, to run, to get out of Dodge, because terrible things are going to happen to the nation of Judah. And yet, in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1, we see that Habakkuk chooses to stay. He says this, he says, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." In a situation like this, the temptation is to leave, to head for the hills and don't look back. But Habakkuk chooses to stay. Now, history is full of men who stayed. If we look to the Titanic, almost 70% of the people on the Titanic died, including more than 100 women, but the rescued were overwhelmingly women and children. Men, because of the size of the crew, were far more numerous on the ship, but still strongly disfavored when loading the lifeboats. Lawrence Astaire writes this: "The crew and the male passengers were so assiduous in following the rule of women and children first that many lifeboats left the Titanic with empty seats. Many more people died than was necessary, because far from pushing each other out of the way, men willingly died in conformity with the moral code of that time." In contrast, though, if we look at the crash of the Costa Concordia, the luxury liner that struck rocks off Italy's west coast in 2012, 32 people died, but Captain Francesco Schettino was one of the first people on the lifeboat, and he was ordered to get back on the cruise ship, but he refused. The whole world needs people who will stay in times of conflict. Now, if we look to chapter 2 of Habakkuk, he gives 5 woes for the proud. In Habakkuk 2, verses 6 to 8, he talks about the thief. He says, "Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on?" And then in Habakkuk 2, verses 9 to 11, he talks about the unjustly wealthy. He says, "Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin." Verse 10, "You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life." In Habakkuk 2, verses 12 to 14, he talks about crooked politicians. It says, "Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice." And then in verse 15 to 18, he talks about the manipulation and abuse of others for your own gain by bringing them shame. See, these verses, they're not about alcohol. They're sending a stern warning to everyone who uses and abuses anyone for their own personal gratification, entertainment, or perversion. And then in Habakkuk 2, verse 17, he says this: "The violence you have done will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. See, he's saying this, he's saying the brokenness of the fall reaches all of creation. So we've been reminded that when sin entered the world, it broke 4 key relationships. The relationship with God and humanity, the relationship between humans, like between me and you, the relationship between humans and creation, and then one other thing. The brokenness broke the relationship between us and ourselves. Habakkuk is pointing out that because of our brokenness, all of God's design for the prosperity of the world has been crushed upon the rocks of our own selfishness. And then the last one, which a lot of people think doesn't relate to us at all, Habakkuk 2 verses 18 to 19 says this: of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Now, we don't have Baal or Asherah, but we do have Bieber and Gomez and Apple and Google. We have big TVs, LED, LCD, plasma, projection, holographic. We have idols, and we worship them more than we are willing to admit. And Habakkuk is asking a valid question in this book, one that resonates with all of us who have struggled to see him, to see God in the midst of such brokenness. If the world is so bad, then why doesn't God do something? And I think the best answer is he is. This is his world, his plan, his timing. We have this beautiful verse in Habakkuk 2 verse 20. It says this, it says, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. When Habakkuk stands on the ramparts and all he sees is death, he can trust that God is in control because God is on his throne. When the earth was formed and everything was good, God was on his throne. And when Adam brought death to everything God made, God was on his throne. Now, when Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a colt and the people called him blessed, God was on his throne. And when Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane as he sweat drops of blood and prayed to his Father, not my will, but yours be done, where was God? On his throne. When Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, God was on his throne. And when they placed the crown of thorns on his head, God was on his throne. And when they nailed him to the cross, God was on his throne. When he breathed his last breath, God was on his throne. And when the stone was rolled away and Jesus stepped out into the blazing light of the third day, God was on his throne. And when I stand before my Creator at the end of my days, God will be on his throne. From the beginning to the end, from the start to the finish, since before even time began and long after time means absolutely nothing, God will be on his throne. And that's why when it feels like we are in the middle of Habakkuk chapter 2 and chapter 3 feels a long way off, we can have the courage to stay because God is on his throne.